The city of New York in the early 1930s was a place of stark contrasts. Towering skyscrapers casting shadows over crowded tenements, glittering lights masking the seedy underworld that thrived in alleys and speakeasies, and opportunity standing side by side with desperation. It was a time when the American dream was pursued with relentless hunger, yet for many, it remained tantalizingly out of reach. Into this turbulent electric atmosphere came Charles Lucky Luciano, a young man whose very presence seemed to crackle with ambition and raw intelligence. Born to Sicilian immigrants in the Lower East Side, Luciano carried the weight of heritage and expectation, but also the unquenchable fire of someone determined to rise above the squalor surrounding him. Even as a child, he had learned the cruel arithmetic of survival. One misstep could mean humiliation, injury, or worse. The streets were a teacher that offered no second chances, and from an early age, Luciano absorbed its lessons with a calculating mind that set him apart from his peers. He walked the fine line between charm and menace, charisma and intimidation, learning how to read the moods of men and the subtle shifts of power. In the cramped apartments and bustling markets of his neighborhood, alliances were fleeting, and loyalty was a currency as fragile as paper money. Young Luciano watched, listened, and memorized every interaction, every slight, and every whispered secret. It was in these moments, among the chaos of immigrant life, that the foundations of his understanding of power and influence were laid. He realized early on that survival depended not merely on strength or fear, but on foresight, strategy, and the ability to manipulate circumstances to his advantage. By the time he reached adolescence, Luciano was no longer just another street kid. He had begun to carve a reputation for himself, small but growing, among the gangs and local operators who recognized his cunning and audacity. He was quick to seize opportunities, whether through minor hustles, gambling schemes, or strategic alliances with more established figures. Unlike many who relied solely on brute force, Luciano had an instinct for long-term vision. He observed the chaos and fragmentation of the criminal underworld and sensed an opening, a chance not just to participate but to redefine the rules of the game entirely. The city itself seemed to conspire with him, providing both challenge and incentive. Every shadowed corner could conceal danger, but it also offered opportunity for those daring enough to claim it. The police patrolled unevenly, corruption was rampant, and political machines created pockets of influence for the shrewd and adaptable. Luciano absorbed the rhythms of this world like a conductor studying an orchestra. He learned when to strike, when to retreat, and when to forge alliances that would serve him later. Each encounter, each minor victory, reinforced his understanding that power was not a single act of dominance but a network of relationships, debts, and threats delicately balanced. By the late 1920s, the seeds of his ascent were already germinating. While other young men remained trapped in menial labor or petty crime, Luciano was building an awareness of his own potential. He understood that charisma, intelligence, and ruthlessness could be combined into a form of influence far more potent than raw violence. And yet, beneath his calculated exterior, there was an urgency born of the street's relentless pressure, a need to rise quickly, to claim space before rivals had the chance to crush him. This combination of intellect, ambition, and circumstance would propel him from the shadows of immigrant tenements into the dazzling, dangerous world of organized crime, setting the stage for both his meteoric rise and the betrayals that awaited him. The streets of New York were unforgiving, a relentless teacher of both survival and ambition. For Charles Lucky Luciano, they were not just a backdrop to his early life. They were a crucible that forged his instincts, shaped his worldview, and honed a mind that could calculate risk and opportunity with almost preternatural precision. Born to Sicilian immigrants who carried the weight of old-world traditions and the trauma of displacement, Luciano grew up surrounded by stories of hardship, resilience, and the invisible codes of honor that governed his community. His family's modest apartment in the Lower East Side was a world of crowded rooms, the smell of simmering tomato sauce and bread permeating the air, and constant negotiations between neighbors who shared walls, resources, and grudges alike. It was a life rich in human interaction, but also one in which patience and strategy were as necessary as food and shelter. From a young age, Luciano observed the intricate social choreography of his neighborhood. He saw men negotiating with a mixture of respect and menace, women wielding influence quietly behind doors, and children learning the same survival skills that had kept their elders alive. Every interaction was a lesson in power: who commanded loyalty, who demanded fear, and who was merely a pawn in someone else's game. Even minor disputes, over territory, stolen goods, or perceived insults, could escalate into violence, and those who hesitated often paid the price. Luciano internalized these dynamics not with fear, but with an analytical curiosity. He learned that observation could be as lethal as a knife, that timing and patience often mattered more than brute strength, and that trust was a fragile, negotiable commodity. School provided little refuge from the pressures of street life, and education was often secondary to the daily grind. Yet even within the cramped, chaotic classrooms, Luciano's intelligence and adaptability stood out. He could read people as easily as he could read words on a page, identifying weaknesses, motivations, and hidden alliances. Outside of school, the neighborhood gangs offered both danger and opportunity. They were microcosms of the larger world he would one day navigate: hierarchies, codes, and constant negotiation for dominance. Luciano began to participate cautiously, testing his influence and learning the unspoken rules that governed these small but potent networks of power. He was observant, calculating, and strategic, traits that set him apart from many of his peers who relied purely on aggression. Family life further sharpened his understanding of loyalty, obligation, and consequence. In the Sicilian tradition, respect for elders and adherence to community expectations were paramount, yet survival often demanded bending or breaking these rules. Luciano witnessed both the protective and restrictive aspects of his upbringing, the warmth of family solidarity and the limitations imposed by poverty and cultural expectation. These experiences instilled in him a dual perspective. He valued loyalty and tradition but recognized when pragmatism and cunning had to override sentiment. This delicate balance between personal ambition and communal obligation would become a defining feature of his later life, shaping the decisions that allowed him to rise above rivals who were less flexible or perceptive. By the time Luciano reached his teenage years, he had already experienced the harshness of failure and the taste of small victories. Minor hustles, petty thefts, and street brawls became the arenas in which he tested his intellect and temperament. Each encounter taught him valuable lessons: when to negotiate, when to intimidate, and when to retreat. He learned to value alliances carefully, recognizing that even the closest friend could become a dangerous rival. More than anything, Luciano internalized the idea that power was relational. It existed not in isolation but in the perception, fear, and loyalty of others. The immigrant neighborhoods of New York, dense with culture, commerce, and clandestine dealings, became his classroom. Luciano observed the rhythm of opportunity: the speakeasies fueled by prohibition, the docks humming with illicit goods, and the unions ripe for influence. He began to imagine a life beyond petty crime, one in which order and strategy could dominate chaos and violence. Even as a young man, he was drawn to the concept of structure within criminal enterprise, a way to transform fragmented gangs into an organized, efficient system that could yield both profit and control. The streets were harsh, but they were also a mirror, reflecting Luciano's ambitions and limitations. Every threat, betrayal, and minor triumph sharpened his instincts. By the end of his adolescence, he had emerged as more than a survivor. He was a strategist, a young man capable of seeing beyond immediate danger to the broader web of opportunity, influence, and leverage. The foundation of his empire was being laid not in boardrooms or grand offices, but in the crowded streets, narrow alleys, and bustling marketplaces of New York, a world that demanded wit, cunning, and an unflinching willingness to act decisively when necessary. It was here, amid the chaos and opportunity, that Luciano's vision of power began to take shape, setting him on a trajectory that would lead him from the shadows of his neighborhood to the pinnacle of organized crime. By the time Luciano reached his late teens, he had moved beyond the role of observer, stepping confidently into the intricate dance of power that governed New York's underworld. No longer merely a street-savvy youth, he became an active participant in the city's petty crime networks, testing his wit, courage, and emerging sense of strategy against rivals who were often older, more experienced, and just as hungry for dominance. Small-time thefts, loan sharking, and protection schemes were his first ventures into organized criminal activity. Each endeavor was more than a means of survival. It was a laboratory where he experimented with the rules of influence, intimidation, and trust. Luciano quickly learned that success in this world required more than brawn. It demanded intelligence, patience, and the ability to read men as clearly as maps of the streets themselves. His reputation began to spread through whispers in the neighborhood. Stories circulated of the young man with a sharp mind, a quick temper when challenged, but also an uncanny ability to anticipate outcomes. Allies were drawn to his confidence and clarity of purpose, while adversaries took note of his audacity. Unlike many of his peers who relied solely on muscle to establish dominance, Luciano developed a nuanced approach that combined charm, strategy, and calculated aggression. He understood that fear could be a tool but loyalty, when earned, was infinitely more valuable. It was this ability to navigate relationships with both subtlety and ruthlessness that distinguished him from the countless others who never rose above the chaotic streets. Luciano's early alliances were deliberate and pragmatic. He connected with older gangsters who recognized his potential, learning from their methods while gradually positioning himself as an equal rather than a subordinate. In these formative years he saw firsthand the fragmented nature of the criminal underworld, rival factions constantly at war, small-time operators vying for scraps, and alliances as fleeting as the city's shadows. The violence was a constant reminder of life's fragility and the thin line separating power from ruin. Yet for Luciano this chaos was not a threat but an opportunity. He saw patterns where others saw randomness, gaps where others saw walls, and a path to ascendancy where others remained trapped in survival mode. One of the defining features of this period was his ability to blend into multiple worlds. In public he could appear as a typical young man of his neighborhood, talking, laughing, working, and occasionally drinking. But in private he honed a calculating mind, mapping out potential moves, evaluating rival strengths, and observing weaknesses in every interaction. He understood that the streets were an ecosystem. Every man, every gang, every law enforcement officer, and every politician played a role in a larger game. Mastery required patience and timing. He could charm, deceive, intimidate, or negotiate depending on what the situation demanded. In essence, Luciano was learning to play chess in a world where the pieces could die at any moment. During this time he also developed an acute understanding of money and its power to shape influence. Even minor operations, gambling, loan sharking, and small-scale theft, taught him how profit could buy loyalty, manipulate decisions, and create leverage over rivals. He began to appreciate that raw violence alone could never create enduring power. Strategy, negotiation, and the careful cultivation of networks were far more potent tools than sheer brutality. Luciano's ambition extended beyond immediate gains. He envisioned a system in which control and profit could coexist, where operations were organized and chaos could be transformed into order. But the path was never simple. Rivalries tested his resolve, betrayals reminded him of the fragility of trust, and narrow escapes from law enforcement instilled both caution and audacity. Each challenge sharpened his instincts and reinforced a lesson that would define his entire career. In the world he aspired to dominate, hesitation was fatal, loyalty was conditional, and foresight was the ultimate weapon. By navigating these trials successfully, he began to distinguish himself from other street operatives who remained trapped in cycles of impulsive crime and reactionary violence. By the late 1920s, Luciano's name had become synonymous with intelligence, adaptability, and ambition. He was no longer merely a rising star in the criminal underworld, he was a young man with a vision, seeing possibilities where others saw limitations. His actions were calculated, each small step deliberate, building the foundation for larger operations. What had begun as minor hustles and street-level thefts evolved into a blueprint for a more significant, more organized enterprise. Luciano was learning to consolidate power, manipulate perception, and use both fear and respect to advance his position. This was the stage on which Luciano would transform from a street-level hustler into a figure capable of reshaping the American mafia. The skills, instincts, and relationships he cultivated during these years would later become the pillars of an empire that spanned cities, industries, and borders. Every lesson learned, every victory, betrayal, and narrow escape, was a stepping stone toward an ascent that would alter the landscape of organized crime forever. The seemingly small and chaotic streets of New York had provided him not just with survival skills but with the blueprint for ambition, strategy, and, ultimately, dominance. As Luciano transitioned from street-level hustles to a more organized approach, the true scope of his ambition began to reveal itself. He did not merely want power, he wanted control, absolute, structured, and enduring. The fragmented underworld of New York, composed of rival gangs constantly clashing over territory and influence, presented both danger and opportunity. Most gang leaders were reactive, driven by emotion, personal vendettas, or short-term gains. Luciano, however, approached the same landscape with the mind of a strategist, envisioning a system where chaos could be harnessed, violence could be regulated, and profit maximized. He saw the potential to consolidate power not just through force, but through organization, alliances, and the careful distribution of influence. Central to this transformation was his ability to forge alliances with figures who were already established but willing to collaborate for mutual benefit. Men like Meyer Lansky, who shared Luciano's vision of a business-oriented criminal enterprise, became partners in both strategy and ambition. Luciano's genius lay in recognizing talent, understanding personalities, and knowing when to employ charm, intimidation, or negotiation. He was not content to dominate through fear alone. He sought loyalty, but loyalty built on respect and calculated reciprocity, not blind obedience. This approach allowed him to unite disparate factions, bridging ethnic divides and personal rivalries in ways that had previously seemed impossible in the mafia world. With these alliances in place, Luciano began to restructure operations. He introduced a level of bureaucracy and division of labor that transformed chaotic street operations into a semi-corporate enterprise. Each faction had clearly defined roles, responsibilities, and territories, reducing internal conflicts and creating a network where loyalty and efficiency were rewarded. Luciano understood that an empire could not rely solely on his personal presence. It needed systems and structures that could function independently while still adhering to his vision. Gambling dens, nightclubs, and bootlegging operations were no longer isolated ventures. They were interconnected nodes in a vast, coordinated network. Luciano's strategic mind extended beyond mere organizational structure. He meticulously studied law enforcement patterns, political influence, and public sentiment. By understanding the levers of power outside the criminal world, he was able to create protective alliances with politicians, police officials, and influential businessmen. Bribes, favors, and quiet negotiations ensured that his operations were shielded from scrutiny, while rivals remained exposed and vulnerable. This interplay of public influence and private control demonstrated a sophisticated understanding of power that went far beyond the capabilities of most contemporary gang leaders. Luciano was building an empire that could survive setbacks, outmaneuver rivals, and extend its influence beyond the streets. Equally important was his understanding of risk and timing. Luciano recognized that the mafia's traditional reliance on violence as a first resort was both inefficient and dangerous. Instead, he emphasized negotiation, calculated intimidation, and strategic displays of force designed to maintain authority without inviting unnecessary retaliation or law enforcement attention. He encouraged his men to follow a hierarchy, to respect the chain of command, and to prioritize the preservation of the organization over individual glory. By instilling discipline and fostering a sense of professionalism, he created an environment where the collective power of the group exceeded the sum of its individual parts. Luciano also recognized the psychological aspects of leadership. He understood the human need for respect, recognition, and security, and he leveraged these desires to maintain loyalty among his men. Rewards, privileges, and strategic promotions ensured that key figures remained committed to his vision, while rivals and dissenters quickly learned the cost of disloyalty. He combined fear with opportunity, making it clear that the system he built offered both protection and advancement, but only for those who adhered to its rules. This delicate balance of carrot and stick became a hallmark of his leadership style and set him apart from the chaotic, emotionally driven bosses who had preceded him. By the mid-1930s, Luciano's influence had extended across the city. His operations were efficient, lucrative, and remarkably resilient, surviving attacks from rival gangs and law enforcement interventions alike. The empire he constructed was more than a collection of criminal ventures. It was a blueprint for modern organized crime. Luciano had demonstrated that power could be systematized, loyalty could be codified, and profit could be extracted without constant chaos. Every decision, every alliance, and every calculated risk contributed to a structure that would endure long after his name became infamous. This phase of Luciano's life marked the turning point from a street-level opportunist to a visionary architect of crime. His rise was not merely a story of ambition rewarded. It was a demonstration of intellectual dominance over a fragmented, violent world. By transforming the mafia into a structured, efficient, and far-reaching enterprise, Luciano established a model that would influence organized crime for decades. The streets that had once tested him now bowed to his strategy, and his name became synonymous not just with criminality, but with power, foresight, and the cold calculation that allowed him to orchestrate an empire while others remained trapped in the cycles of petty violence and chaos. Yet even as he reached the height of this phase, Luciano's vision contained an inherent fragility. Empires built on fear, loyalty, and calculated alliances are always susceptible to betrayal, ambition, and unforeseen challenges. Every network he constructed relied on the careful management of human psychology, and the slightest miscalculation could unravel years of careful planning. Unbeknownst to him, the seeds of conflict and treachery were already present, quietly growing within his closest circles, waiting for the moment when ambition, envy, and opportunity would collide. It was the paradox of power. The very structure that elevated him also contained the potential for his undoing, a truth that would soon manifest in ways no strategist could fully predict. Among the many forces that defined Lucky Luciano's empire, none was more critical, or more psychologically binding, than the Code of Silence, the Omerta. This unwritten law of the mafia was more than a set of rules. It was a moral and psychological framework that governed every interaction, every alliance, and every act of loyalty. Omerta dictated that a man's word, his discretion, and his ability to remain invisible to the law were sacred. To break it was to invite death, exile, or permanent disgrace. For Luciano, understanding, enforcing, and manipulating this code became as essential as any tactical maneuver, financial scheme, or territorial expansion. It was both a shield and a sword, protecting his empire while simultaneously shaping the psychology of everyone who operated within it. The power of Omerta lay not only in fear, but in the trust it cultivated among those who adhered to it. Loyalty became currency, silence a weapon, and betrayal an unimaginable offense. Every member of the organization, from the lowest-ranking enforcer to the most trusted lieutenant, internalized the consequences of disobedience. The code created a shared language of loyalty and honor that transcended individual ambitions. To Luciano, this was both practical and psychological. It instilled discipline, regulated behavior, and fostered cohesion in an environment where chaos was the default state. The mafia, under his guidance, became a structured society in miniature, governed not by the law of the land, but by the law of the streets, interpreted through the lens of loyalty and fear. Yet Omerta was not a simple rule to enforce. It was a living, breathing set of principles that required constant vigilance. Luciano understood human nature, the ambition, envy, and greed that could unravel even the most tightly knit network. He cultivated a culture in which loyalty was rewarded, disloyalty punished, and every member knew that their actions were both observed and calculated. Even casual missteps could be interpreted as threats to the hierarchy, and Luciano ensured that the consequences were swift and public enough to reinforce the code's authority. Fear alone could not sustain loyalty. It needed to be balanced with opportunity, recognition, and tangible rewards. By blending discipline with incentive, Luciano created a psychological environment in which Omerta became internalized, an almost instinctive guideline for behavior within his organization. The code also served as a powerful strategic tool. In dealings with rival gangs, law enforcement, and political figures, Omerta allowed Luciano to project control and unpredictability. No one outside the organization could be certain of what his men knew, what they would reveal, or how they would act. This ambiguity created a psychological edge as fear of exposure, or worse, retribution, kept both allies and adversaries in check. Internally, it minimized the risk of betrayal, ensuring that critical knowledge of operations, finances, and strategic plans remained contained. The system was elegant in its simplicity, yet brutally effective, relying on a combination of moral obligation, self-interest, and the ever-present specter of violent consequences. The psychological dimension of Omerta extended beyond loyalty. It shaped identity. Members of Luciano's organization were defined not just by what they did, but by what they withheld: words, information, confessions. Silence became a virtue, a testament to character and a measure of trustworthiness. It reinforced the hierarchy, as those who adhered to the code gained respect, influence, and access, while violators were marginalized or eliminated. In this way, Omerta was both adhesive and selective, binding the organization together while weeding out weakness, ambition, or moral compromise that could threaten the empire. Luciano's genius lay not only in enforcing Omerta, but in exploiting its psychological dynamics. He understood that fear alone could provoke desperation, but fear combined with respect, ambition, and calculated reward could create a self-sustaining network of loyalty. He used the code to manage human behavior with precision, predicting reactions to incentives, threats, and challenges. His ability to manipulate the delicate balance between fear and opportunity became a hallmark of his leadership, allowing him to maintain control over an empire that could have easily fractured under less disciplined or insightful management. Yet Omerta was not foolproof. The very human traits it sought to suppress, envy, ambition, greed, and fear, always lingered beneath the surface. Luciano knew that cracks would appear, and that vigilance, psychological insight, and decisive action would be required to prevent betrayal from toppling the carefully constructed hierarchy. This awareness of potential vulnerability added a layer of tension to his operations, a constant reminder that power, even when systematized, was fragile. The code was both shield and trap, a system of order within chaos, yet inherently dependent on human behavior that could never be entirely controlled. By embedding omerta into the structure of his empire, Luciano transformed the mafia from a collection of violent gangs into a disciplined, cohesive, and psychologically bound organization. The code shaped behavior, regulated relationships, and created a culture in which loyalty was both expected and enforced. It allowed for strategic risk-taking while maintaining a foundation of trust and fear, providing the stability necessary for the expansive operations that would define his career. In essence, omerta became one of Luciano's greatest tools, a mechanism through which he could command loyalty, suppress dissent, and orchestrate the complex machinery of power with precision and foresight. It was within this framework of silence, loyalty, and fear that the true extent of Luciano's genius became visible. Not merely a criminal, not merely a strategist, he was a master of human psychology, understanding instinctively that an empire could only thrive if its members were bound not just by necessity, but by an internalized code of conduct that disciplined their ambitions and fears. Omerta was the invisible architecture of his empire, and through it, Luciano not only survived, but thrived, turning a chaotic underworld into a structured, controlled, and enormously profitable enterprise that would become the blueprint for modern organized crime. By the early 1930s, Lucky Luciano had established himself not just as a rising figure in the underworld, but as a visionary architect of criminal enterprise. He recognized that traditional street-level crime, mugging, petty theft, and small-time rackets, was fleeting, unstable, and ultimately unprofitable for those with grander ambitions. Luciano's genius lay in his ability to transform illegal activity into an organized, systematic business. He approached crime with the mind of an entrepreneur, seeing the potential for scalable operations, strategic investments, and networks that could generate immense wealth while maintaining control over those who executed them. Gambling was one of his first arenas of experimentation. The demand for games of chance in a city recovering from the economic strain of the Great Depression was insatiable, and Luciano seized the opportunity to establish controlled gambling operations. He didn't simply run these operations haphazardly. He created systems in which the flow of money, the management of clientele, and the distribution of profits were all carefully calculated. Loyalty was enforced among employees, risks were minimized through careful oversight, and competitors were either absorbed, intimidated, or eliminated. Gambling, in Luciano's hands, became more than a pastime for the desperate. It was a mechanism for influence, wealth, and the consolidation of power. Prostitution, another key component of his empire, was similarly structured with precision. Rather than allowing disorder or independent operators to dominate, Luciano introduced systems of regulation, oversight, and hierarchy. Women and madams were integrated into a broader network, with their activities monitored and profits distributed according to a carefully devised plan. Protection, coercion, and incentive were combined to ensure compliance, loyalty, and efficiency. In this way, what might have been chaotic or dangerous enterprises became streamlined, profitable, and strategically advantageous, demonstrating Luciano's ability to systematize even the most morally complex operations. Bootlegging and smuggling, although waning in the post-Prohibition era, had already provided Luciano with a template for logistics, influence, and the coordination of complex networks. He applied lessons learned from these operations, such as the importance of secrecy, timing, and the strategic use of intermediaries, to new ventures. Luciano understood that a legal business required both flexibility and discipline, adaptability in the face of changing circumstances, yet strict adherence to operational hierarchies and protocols. By integrating these principles into every venture, he created a network that was simultaneously resilient, efficient, and immensely profitable. Labor racketeering became another pillar of his empire. Unions, particularly those in shipping and construction, were fertile grounds for manipulation. Luciano used his understanding of human behavior, persuasion, and intimidation to infiltrate and control unions, extracting financial gain and consolidating influence. Strikes, sabotage, and negotiations were orchestrated not for ideological purposes, but as strategic moves in a broader game of profit and power. By controlling the flow of labor and understanding the political levers that governed it, Luciano transformed unions from independent entities into instruments that served his overarching criminal enterprise. The sophistication of his approach was evident in the way he integrated these diverse operations into a cohesive network. Each venture, gambling, prostitution, smuggling, labor manipulation, was not an isolated profit center, but a node in a larger system. Resources were allocated strategically, intelligence was shared among trusted lieutenants, and rival factions were co-opted or neutralized through a combination of negotiation, intimidation, and strategic alliances. This level of organization was unprecedented, creating an empire in which information, influence, and financial gain flowed seamlessly across previously chaotic criminal territories. Luciano's success in business also relied on his understanding of perception and leverage. He cultivated a public image that was calculated and controlled, allowing him to navigate the murky waters of law enforcement, media scrutiny, and political influence. Bribery, favors, and behind-the-scenes manipulation ensured that investigations remained manageable, while competitors remained vulnerable. In this sense, Luciano's enterprise was not merely criminal, it was a psychological operation, in which the appearance of control and omnipotence amplified his actual power. What truly set Luciano apart, however, was his ability to blend rational management with the raw human elements of ambition, fear, and loyalty. He recognized that systems and protocols could only succeed if the people operating them were motivated, disciplined, and aligned with the organization's goals. To that end, he combined carrot and stick approaches, rewards, promotions, and privileges for those who demonstrated loyalty and competence, coupled with swift and often brutal consequences for disloyalty or incompetence. This combination of incentives and fear created a workforce that was both obedient and ambitious, ensuring the sustainability and expansion of his empire. By transforming illegal trades into organized, meticulously controlled enterprises, Luciano not only increased profit margins, but also reduced operational risk. Violence was no longer the default strategy. It became a calculated tool used only when necessary. Decision-making was centralized, communication channels were established, and contingency plans were in place for nearly every scenario. Through this combination of foresight, strategy, and psychological insight, Luciano created a model for organized crime that was as systematic and disciplined as any legitimate business of the era. Ultimately, the business of crime under Luciano was a reflection of his vision, a fusion of ruthless ambition, strategic genius, and psychological mastery. He understood that power was sustained not by brute force alone, but by control, coordination, and the careful management of human behavior. His criminal enterprises were profitable, resilient, and innovative, demonstrating an intelligence and organizational skill that would influence the structure of organized crime for decades to come. In this way, Luciano was not merely a gangster. He was an architect, a visionary who recognized that the criminal world could be organized, systematized, and elevated to a level of strategic sophistication previously unseen. By the mid-1930s, Lucky Luciano's empire had grown vast, intricate, and highly profitable, but with expansion came complexity. Every operation, gambling, prostitution, bootlegging, and labor racketeering, relied not only on systems and organization but also on the delicate management of human relationships. Allies could become rivals, friendships were shadowed by ambition, and every negotiation carried the potential for betrayal. Luciano understood this better than anyone. To maintain power, he had to navigate a world filled with both strategic partnerships and hidden enemies. The ability to discern who was loyal, who was ambitious, and who might be plotting behind his back became as critical as managing the logistics of his criminal enterprises. Among his closest allies were men like Meyer Lansky, the financial brain of the operation, whose keen intellect complemented Luciano's own strategic vision. Frank Costello, with his political connections and ability to navigate both legal and illicit spheres, provided a stabilizing influence. These relationships were forged through mutual respect, shared ambition, and a recognition of each other's strengths. Luciano understood that alliances were more than convenient partnerships. They were essential mechanisms for extending influence and securing the empire's foundation. Yet he also knew that every ally had their own ambitions, and that loyalty could not be assumed. It had to be earned and constantly reinforced through trust, reward, and mutual dependence. At the same time, rivals lurked at every level. Figures like Vito Genovese and other ambitious underbosses eyed opportunities to undermine or displace him, driven by envy, greed, or the allure of power. The mafia world was a constant chessboard, and Luciano's genius lay in anticipating moves not only of his allies but also of those who sought to destabilize him. He cultivated a network of intelligence, relying on information from trusted lieutenants, observations of rival behavior, and the careful monitoring of alliances and grievances. Knowledge was power, and in a world where one misstep could lead to violent consequences, being several steps ahead was often the difference between survival and disaster. The dynamics of loyalty and betrayal were complicated further by the human tendency toward ambition and desire. Even those closest to Luciano were capable of envy, resentment, or sudden opportunism. He mitigated these risks by creating a balance of incentives and fear, rewards for loyalty, opportunities for influence and wealth, and swift, unmistakable consequences for betrayal. This duality, carrot and stick, became a psychological framework through which he maintained control. Men knew that while obedience could elevate them, deviation could be catastrophic. In this way he managed not just operations but the very emotions and motivations of those around him. Alliances, however, were never static. The fluidity of loyalty required constant attention. Luciano frequently negotiated, renegotiated, and reinforced relationships, often using subtle manipulation or strategic concessions to maintain cohesion. He understood that power was relational. It existed not merely in wealth or force but in perception, trust, and influence. A leader who underestimated the ambitions or resentments of his closest allies risked implosion, and Luciano was acutely aware that the stability of his empire depended on balancing competing interests without alienating key figures. Betrayal, though, was always a looming threat. In a world driven by ambition and fear, a single act of treachery could ripple through the organization, destabilizing operations and eroding trust. Luciano's approach combined vigilance with strategic preemption. He encouraged loyalty, monitored dissent, and sometimes manipulated rivalries to ensure that potential threats neutralized each other rather than targeting him directly. He understood the psychology of betrayal, why men would turn, what pressures could provoke disloyalty, and how to mitigate risk while maintaining authority. This constant interplay between trust and suspicion became one of the defining features of his leadership style. Even as he managed these high-stakes relationships, Luciano's public persona remained carefully controlled. To outsiders he projected confidence, charisma, and an aura of untouchable authority. This cultivated image reinforced loyalty among allies and intimidation among rivals, amplifying his power through perception. Within his inner circle, men understood that their fates were intertwined with his decisions, their success and survival contingent on remaining aligned with his vision. The combination of strategic intelligence, psychological insight, and personal authority allowed Luciano to navigate a world fraught with hidden threats, ensuring that his empire remained both powerful and remarkably cohesive. Yet, the very elements that strengthened his empire, alliances, loyalty, and careful orchestration of human behavior, also contained the seeds of vulnerability. Ambition is rarely extinguished entirely, and envy, greed, and opportunity can erode even the most tightly controlled networks. Luciano's challenge was perpetual, to maintain dominance while preventing internal fissures from growing into open conflict. It was a delicate dance, requiring both ruthlessness and foresight, and his success during this period solidified his reputation as a leader who could command not just operations, but the hearts and minds of those who wielded power within them. This intricate web of allies and enemies set the stage for the conflicts that would follow. Luciano's rise was not simply a matter of organizational genius. It was a testament to his psychological mastery, his ability to manipulate loyalty, and his skill in managing ambition and threat. Every relationship was a potential asset or liability, every alliance a calculated risk, and every rival a puzzle to solve. In this world, power was never static. It had to be constantly negotiated, defended, and reinforced. Luciano's brilliance lay in his ability to operate at this level of complexity, navigating human ambition and fear with precision, foresight, and an almost uncanny understanding of the forces that could either bolster or destroy him. As Lucky Luciano's empire expanded, the surface of success masked the hidden conflicts that simmered beneath. The world he had meticulously organized was far from stable. Rival gangs, ambitious underbosses, and law enforcement pressures created a landscape in which every move had consequences, and even a single misstep could ignite chaos. Luciano understood that power in the criminal underworld was not merely about domination. It was about survival, perception, and the constant navigation of threats that were often invisible until they erupted with devastating force. This was the hidden war, a complex interplay of loyalty, ambition, fear, and strategic calculation that defined his reign. The city itself was a battlefield, though not one marked by open warfare alone. Territory disputes, rivalries over gambling dens, control of labor unions, and competition in vice operations created a network of pressure points that required constant attention. Luciano could not rely solely on intimidation. He had to anticipate and manipulate the ambitions of allies and enemies alike. Information became the most valuable currency. Every whispered conversation, every alliance formed or broken, every subtle shift in loyalty was a signal that could indicate opportunity or threat. In this environment, foresight was a weapon, and Luciano wielded it with precision. One of the defining challenges of this period was the delicate balance between expansion and containment. As Luciano absorbed rival operations and extended his influence, he simultaneously had to prevent internal fractures. Ambitious lieutenants, potential traitors, and opportunistic allies required careful management. The slightest misjudgment could provoke rebellion or betrayal. Luciano's approach was both proactive and reactive. He cultivated loyalty through rewards, recognition, and inclusion, while monitoring dissent, manipulating rivalries, and decisively eliminating threats when necessary. This strategic equilibrium allowed him to extend his empire while minimizing internal destabilization. Government pressure added another layer of complexity. Police, prosecutors, and federal agents were increasingly aware of Luciano's growing influence. Prohibition-era laws, tax violations, and emerging regulations created legal vulnerabilities that had to be carefully navigated. Luciano, however, had learned to operate within these constraints with sophistication. Bribery, influence over politicians, and the cultivation of informants allowed him to manipulate the legal environment to his advantage. He transformed potential threats into calculated variables, turning law enforcement pressures into opportunities to further consolidate power. The hidden war was fought not only in alleys and speakeasies but in offices, courtrooms, and the shadows of political machinery. Turf wars between gangs were another constant source of tension. Even minor disputes could escalate into full-blown conflict if mismanaged. Luciano's genius was his ability to anticipate rival strategies and neutralize them before they spiraled out of control. Negotiation, intimidation, and strategic violence were applied with discernment, ensuring that he remained dominant without provoking unnecessary retaliation. By controlling both the narrative and the perception of power, Luciano maintained an aura of invincibility that reinforced loyalty and deterred rivals. Fear was wielded selectively, not recklessly, and respect was cultivated alongside it to create a psychologically stable hierarchy. The hidden war also extended into the inner workings of his organization. As his empire grew, the potential for betrayal increased. Ambitious lieutenants, enforcers, and associates constantly weighed their options, sometimes challenging authority or plotting behind closed doors. Luciano's approach combined vigilance with manipulation. He created structures in which potential conflicts could be observed, rivalries could be leveraged, and loyalty could be rewarded or tested. Information networks, trusted lieutenants, and psychological insight allowed him to maintain control even in the face of potential mutiny. He understood that an empire was only as strong as the cohesion of its people, and that human ambition had to be managed as carefully as finances or operations. Political and social factors further complicated the landscape. The Great Depression had left many desperate, creating both opportunity and volatility. Immigrant communities, while providing a base of loyalty, were also susceptible to unrest and manipulation by competing factions. Luciano's ability to navigate this socio-political terrain demonstrated his skill as both strategist and psychologist. He understood that influence extended beyond the immediate organization. It reached into communities, institutions, and the broader currents of public sentiment. Every decision he made had ripple effects that could either reinforce stability or ignite conflict. By the late 1930s, the hidden war had become a defining element of Luciano's leadership. It was fought in shadows and whispers, through manipulation, strategy, and the careful orchestration of human behavior. While his empire appeared controlled and efficient on the surface, beneath lay a constant flux of ambition, rivalry, and danger. Luciano's brilliance was in his ability to anticipate these challenges, to convert potential chaos into opportunity, and to maintain dominance through a combination of foresight, psychological mastery, and strategic ruthlessness. Ultimately, this phase of his reign revealed the true cost of power. The hidden war demanded constant vigilance, emotional intelligence, and decisiveness. It required managing not just operations, but the ambitions, fears, and loyalties of everyone connected to his empire. Luciano's ability to navigate these complexities reinforced his status as a master strategist, but it also foreshadowed the vulnerabilities that would later be exploited in his downfall. In this relentless, shadowy battlefield, power was never permanent, loyalty was always conditional, and the next move, by ally or enemy, could tip the balance between dominance and ruin. Even the most meticulously constructed empire is vulnerable to sudden shifts, and for Lucky Luciano, the seeds of his downfall were already taking root. By the late 1930s, his operations were extensive, his influence unmatched, and his reputation as the orchestrator of New York's criminal underworld solidified. Yet, power in this world is always precarious, and ambition, envy, and law enforcement scrutiny are relentless adversaries. The fall begins not with one dramatic event, but through a series of pressures, some external, some internal, that collectively unravel even the most disciplined of empires. For Luciano, the first cracks appeared subtly as betrayal, miscalculation, and the unyielding gaze of the law began to converge. Rival mobsters, embittered by his dominance and strategic acumen, began to test boundaries, probing for weakness. Men like Vito Genovese and other ambitious figures saw opportunities to reclaim influence or carve out power for themselves. These challenges, while not immediately catastrophic, demanded constant attention and judgment. Luciano's genius had always been in preempting threats, but the web of alliances and rivalries he had cultivated over years was now under strain. One misstep, a misjudged ally, a miscalculated threat, or an overlooked slight, could trigger a cascade of betrayal, exposing vulnerabilities that had previously been hidden beneath layers of strategy and psychological insight. At the same time, law enforcement pressure intensified. The federal government, increasingly aware of Luciano's extensive operations, began to close in. Investigations that had once been sporadic or easily influenced now became methodical and relentless. Surveillance, wiretaps, and informants within his organization eroded the security that had long been taken for granted. For the first time, Luciano faced the reality that the very empire he had built to operate above the chaos of street crime was now squarely in the sights of a legal system that refused to be intimidated. His ability to navigate these pressures would be tested as never before, requiring the full application of his strategic mind and psychological insight. The personal dimension of betrayal added further complexity. Even those who had long been loyal could be swayed by opportunity, fear, or ambition. The carefully maintained balance of carrot and stick, the system of incentives and consequences that had ensured obedience, was increasingly strained. Some of Luciano's closest allies began to question their positions, their loyalty tested by bribes, promises of power, or fear of prosecution. Every interaction became a negotiation, every alliance a potential liability. The psychological warfare that had once been a tool of control now became a source of vulnerability, as the human element of his organization threatened to unravel the meticulous architecture he had built. A key factor in the beginning of his fall was the interplay between public perception and internal dynamics. The media, increasingly fascinated by the power and audacity of Luciano's operations, amplified both his reputation and his exposure. Stories of violence, corruption, and manipulation brought unwanted attention, forcing him to balance the need for secrecy with the reality of notoriety. Public scrutiny, combined with legal investigations and internal rivalries, created a pressure cooker environment in which one error could have catastrophic consequences. The very visibility that had enhanced his power and deterred rivals now became a source of danger. This period also revealed the fragility of even the most loyal alliances. Men who had once been partners in strategy and ambition began to prioritize their own survival, wealth, or advancement over adherence to Luciano's vision. The human instinct for self-preservation collided with the strictures of omerta, producing tension that was invisible until it erupted. For Luciano, recognizing these shifts was as crucial as controlling his criminal operations. Every sign of wavering loyalty, every whispered conversation, and every unexplained action had to be interpreted through the lens of potential betrayal. Misjudgment could lead not just to financial loss, but to violent retaliation or collapse of the organization. By the time arrests began to be made, the fall was no longer avoidable. It started with investigations into corruption, racketeering, and murder, each probe peeling back layers of secrecy. Trusted lieutenants were compromised, informants emerged, and the system of fear and loyalty that had protected Luciano began to erode. The intricacy of his empire, once its greatest strength, now made it vulnerable. The more extensive the network, the more nodes through which exposure could occur. The very genius of Luciano's organization, its scale, complexity, and interconnectivity, magnified the impact of every betrayal and misstep. As law enforcement closed in, the psychological weight of the impending collapse began to bear down. The same instincts that had fueled his rise, cunning, anticipation, and control over human behavior, now demanded defensive strategy. Decisions had to be made swiftly, alliances reinforced, and potential threats neutralized before they could escalate. For the first time in his career, Luciano faced a situation where no amount of foresight could guarantee absolute control. The hidden war that had sustained his empire in the shadows of New York was now becoming an overt struggle for survival, one that would redefine his power, influence, and ultimately his legacy. The fall begins not with a single dramatic confrontation, but with the accumulation of pressures: betrayal, legal scrutiny, rival ambition, and the inexorable consequences of human desire. For Luciano, these forces converged with precision, exposing the vulnerability that had been invisible during the peak of his rise. Every advantage he had cultivated, the intelligence network, the loyalty of his men, and the carefully maintained perception of control, was tested against the relentless dynamics of law, human ambition, and unforeseen circumstances. The first stages of the fall were subtle yet inexorable, a reminder that even the most powerful empires, no matter how skillfully constructed, are ultimately dependent on forces beyond a single man's control. The courtroom had become the stage on which Lucky Luciano's carefully constructed empire would face its most public and consequential test. By the time his trial commenced, the aura of invincibility that had long surrounded him was under siege. Reporters, photographers, and curious onlookers filled every available space, turning a legal proceeding into a spectacle that mirrored the drama and intensity of his criminal life. The trial was more than a legal battle. It was a psychological theater, a clash of narratives, reputations, and strategy where every word, gesture, and reaction was scrutinized, and where the stakes extended far beyond the courtroom itself. From the opening moments, the tension was palpable. The prosecution, armed with decades of law enforcement intelligence, detailed evidence, and testimony from informants, painted a portrait of Luciano as the undisputed kingpin of New York's criminal underworld. Witnesses described intricate operations of gambling, prostitution, and labor manipulation, connecting him to acts of violence and corruption that spanned years. The narrative was meticulously constructed to portray him as a calculating, cold-blooded orchestrator of crime who had used intelligence and charm to manipulate friends, allies, and adversaries alike. Each revelation chipped away at the carefully cultivated image of control that Luciano had maintained for years. Luciano, however, was far from passive. In the courtroom, he displayed the same calculated composure, psychological insight, and strategic thinking that had guided him throughout his rise. He understood the power of perception, the influence of subtle gestures, and the impact of carefully measured responses. Every reaction was deliberate: a confident glance, a measured nod, a subtle smile that communicated control even under intense scrutiny. He leveraged charm and intimidation in equal measure, sending signals to allies, opponents, and observers alike. The courtroom became another arena in which he waged war, this time with words, presence, and the careful management of image and narrative. The media frenzy surrounding the trial added another layer of complexity. Newspapers, radio commentators, and journalists amplified every detail, transforming the legal process into a public spectacle of fascination and horror. The story of Luciano's criminal empire captivated the public imagination, blending elements of myth, fear, and intrigue. While this attention heightened scrutiny and pressure, it also allowed Luciano to control perception indirectly, projecting an image of composure, dominance, and unshakable authority even as his empire faced unprecedented legal jeopardy. The trial was not merely a measure of guilt or innocence. It was a contest over narrative, reputation, and psychological leverage. Strategically, the courtroom dynamics mirrored the broader conflicts of his criminal life. The prosecution's witnesses were not just sources of evidence. They were psychological instruments, capable of shaping opinion, sowing doubt, and influencing jurors' perceptions. Luciano's defense had to navigate this landscape carefully, balancing denial, strategic admissions, and the manipulation of sentiment to protect both his legal standing and the ongoing cohesion of his empire outside the courtroom. Every statement, objection, and cross-examination became a chess move, with consequences that extended far beyond the immediate moment. Beneath the surface of legal maneuvering, the trial exposed the vulnerabilities inherent in Luciano's empire. The reliance on omerta, the careful management of loyalty, and the strategic cultivation of fear and respect were tested under the intense scrutiny of testimony, investigation, and cross-examination. Informants, embittered former allies, or coerced witnesses threatened to unravel networks that had been meticulously maintained for years. Each revelation posed not only a legal risk but a psychological one, challenging the perceptions of those still loyal and testing the limits of influence that had once seemed absolute. The moral dimension of the trial also became apparent. For the public, Luciano represented the intersection of genius, criminality, and audacity. His operations, though structured and strategic, were inseparable from violence, exploitation, and corruption. The courtroom became a forum for society to confront these contradictions, to reconcile the brilliance of organizational acumen with the brutality of criminal conduct. For Luciano, this scrutiny was both a threat and an opportunity. He could not escape judgment, but he could shape how that judgment was perceived, framing himself as a master strategist ensnared by circumstance, rather than simply a violent criminal. The verdict, when it came, marked a turning point not only in Luciano's life but in the broader history of organized crime. The sentence reflected both the weight of evidence and the societal need to assert control over a man who had transformed crime into a sophisticated enterprise. The courtroom drama, with all its tension, theatricality, and psychological complexity, underscored the duality of Luciano's existence. A man who had commanded power through intellect, loyalty, and fear, now confronted with the ultimate test of human and institutional forces aligned against him. In the aftermath, the trial had lasting consequences for both Luciano and the world he had constructed. His empire continued to function, but the balance of power shifted, alliances were tested, and the underworld recalibrated in response to his vulnerability. The courtroom had exposed the fragility of even the most carefully orchestrated networks, demonstrating that law, perception, and human ambition could converge to challenge power that once seemed untouchable. The trial was more than a legal proceeding. It was a crucible in which the myths of invincibility, loyalty, and strategic mastery were tested against the harsh realities of law, betrayal, and societal scrutiny. Ultimately, the trial and sentencing marked the beginning of the end for Luciano's unchallenged dominance. It illuminated the limits of even the most disciplined empire when confronted with the combined forces of law, ambition, and human fallibility. Yet, even in the face of conviction, Luciano's strategic genius, psychological insight, and capacity for manipulation ensured that he would continue to wield influence, albeit in a more constrained and precarious form, setting the stage for the next chapter of his remarkable, complex, and ultimately tragic story. Even behind the cold, iron bars of prison, Lucky Luciano's influence did not diminish. The man who had orchestrated New York's criminal underworld from the streets, nightclubs, and hidden offices now faced confinement, yet his mind remained free, sharp, and calculating. Prison, rather than being a complete interruption to his power, became a new arena, a confined space in which his strategic genius, psychological insight, and ability to manipulate human behavior could still operate. Luciano understood that leadership was not limited to physical presence. It was exercised through intelligence, communication, and perception. In this environment, he discovered the subtle art of controlling operations from behind walls, turning confinement into an extension of his influence. The first challenge was maintaining loyalty among his men on the outside. The structure of his empire relied heavily on the network of lieutenants, enforcers, and trusted associates who had been trained to follow his vision and enforce omerta. Luciano understood that even a hint of uncertainty about his leadership could destabilize years of careful organization. Through coded messages, trusted intermediaries, and carefully orchestrated communication, he continued to give instructions, manage disputes, and ensure that his network remained cohesive. His influence transcended the prison walls, proving that his authority was rooted not in proximity, but in the respect and fear he commanded. Prison also provided an unexpected opportunity, the ability to observe human behavior in a controlled environment. Luciano was surrounded by men from all walks of life, some hardened criminals, some political prisoners, all navigating their own complex social hierarchies. He studied their interactions, alliances, and rivalries with the same strategic mind that had once coordinated citywide operations. This environment became a laboratory for understanding power dynamics, loyalty, and manipulation on a personal level. Every conversation, every observed reaction, and every subtle shift in behavior became data that he could leverage to maintain authority and prepare for eventual re-entry into the broader world. Even as his empire continued to operate externally, Luciano faced new pressures internally. Rival inmates, guards, and bureaucratic restrictions tested his patience, resolve, and ingenuity. Yet, he approached these challenges with the same calculated precision that had defined his rise. He formed alliances within the prison system, leveraged connections, and applied psychological insight to navigate conflicts and assert dominance subtly. His ability to influence outcomes without overt displays of violence or authority demonstrated a level of strategic sophistication that few could match. In this confined theater, Luciano was not merely surviving. He was consolidating knowledge, strengthening networks, and maintaining the aura of power that had always been central to his identity. At the same time, prison highlighted the fragility of empire. While external operations could be managed, internal loyalty required constant attention. Associates outside needed reassurance, information, and direction, while potential rivals and ambitious lieutenants tested boundaries. Luciano's brilliance was in recognizing which relationships required direct intervention, which could be managed indirectly, and which needed careful psychological maneuvering to prevent disruption. This balancing act demanded precision, patience, and foresight, skills that had been honed over decades but were now tested in a more constrained and unpredictable environment. The role of perception was magnified in prison. Guards, fellow inmates, and external allies all interpreted actions, rumors, and gestures as signals of power or weakness. Luciano understood that maintaining an aura of unassailable authority was crucial, and he cultivated it with care. Subtle displays of confidence, controlled interactions, and strategic communication ensured that his influence remained intact. Fear, respect, and admiration were as essential within the prison walls as they had been on the streets, and Luciano wielded them with remarkable precision. Despite confinement, Luciano's operations outside continued to expand under his indirect supervision. He coordinated strategies, managed rivalries, and ensured that the flow of profit and information remained uninterrupted. His ability to maintain this level of control demonstrated not only organizational brilliance but also a profound understanding of human psychology. Men who reported to him or observed his commands understood that he remained the ultimate authority, even if physically removed. This capacity to project power from a distance redefined the concept of leadership within the underworld, proving that control was as much about perception, intellect, and psychological mastery as it was about proximity or force. Prison also forced reflection. For a man whose life had been defined by ambition, strategy, and dominance, confinement provided a rare pause to consider legacy, loyalty, and the impermanence of power. The world outside was still in motion, alliances shifted and threats emerged, but the pause allowed Luciano to refine his long-term vision. He understood that survival and influence required adaptation, and that even within the rigid confines of incarceration, strategic thinking could shape outcomes, protect assets, and preserve authority. Ultimately, Luciano's time behind bars demonstrated the resilience of his genius. While incarceration represented a physical limitation, it did not diminish the core elements that had allowed him to rise to power: psychological insight, strategic foresight, and the ability to manipulate human behavior. Prison became another battlefield, one in which intellect and perception replaced direct action, yet the stakes were equally high. Through careful management of communication, alliances, and reputation, Luciano ensured that his empire did not crumble in his absence, proving that true power is as much about mind and strategy as it is about wealth, violence, or proximity. Even as the years passed, the lessons of confinement echoed throughout the underworld. Luciano had survived external threats, internal rivalries, and legal pressures, demonstrating a capacity for resilience that few could match. His ability to operate from prison not only preserved his empire but also reinforced the psychological principle that loyalty and authority are maintained through perception, strategic foresight, and the careful orchestration of human behavior. In this way, even behind bars, Luciano remained the master of his empire, a strategist whose influence transcended physical constraints and whose legacy would endure in the very structure of organized crime itself. After years of navigating the treacherous corridors of power, both on the streets and behind bars, Lucky Luciano faced the ultimate disruption to his empire: deportation. In 1946, following his release from prison under the condition of immediate removal from the United States, he was sent back to Italy, a land that was at once familiar and foreign, a place where his influence was diminished yet the opportunities for strategic maneuvering remained. This exile represented a profound shift in both his personal trajectory and the structure of the criminal world he had meticulously built. It was not merely a geographic relocation. It was a psychological and operational turning point that would test his ability to adapt, survive, and assert influence in new, unpredictable circumstances. The transition to Italy was complicated. Post-war Italy was recovering from devastation, political instability, and social upheaval. Luciano, accustomed to the tightly organized criminal networks of New York, found himself in a very different environment, where alliances were fragmented, rival factions competed for influence, and the social and political landscape was unfamiliar. Despite these challenges, he applied the same strategic vision that had guided him in America. He began to cultivate new connections, assess opportunities, and leverage the few resources and contacts that remained at his disposal. Exile, while restrictive, did not eliminate his capacity for influence. It merely transformed the nature of the battlefield. Luciano's reputation preceded him. Even in Italy, whispers of his organizational genius, his psychological acumen, and his dominance in New York had circulated widely. Allies and rivals alike recognized that the man who had orchestrated the American Mafia's golden age was not to be underestimated. This recognition allowed him to exercise influence indirectly, coordinating operations, offering counsel, and maintaining a presence in the criminal underworld that extended beyond national borders. Exile became, paradoxically, a platform for long-distance power, demonstrating that influence does not always require physical proximity. It thrives on reputation, strategy, and the careful orchestration of human behavior. Despite these advantages, exile also highlighted the limits of power. Luciano could no longer directly manage the sprawling operations he had once controlled, and his absence opened space for rivals, ambitious lieutenants, and competing factions to test boundaries. The empire he had built was resilient, yet vulnerable, and his ability to guide it from afar required careful negotiation, diplomacy, and sometimes ruthless intervention through proxies. This period emphasized the fragility of even the most sophisticated criminal networks. Without direct control, influence could be challenged, alliances strained, and the meticulously maintained hierarchy destabilized. Luciano's approach to exile was strategic and calculated. He maintained connections with American associates, coordinated the flow of information, and continued to exercise a degree of oversight over operations, ensuring that his vision and authority were respected. This remote management required a blend of trust, psychological insight, and enforcement through intermediaries. Even without direct access to the streets, he remained a central figure in decision-making, proving that leadership is often as much about perception, respect, and reputation as it is about physical presence. The exile also prompted reflection and adaptation. Removed from the immediate pressures of New York, Luciano had the opportunity to analyze his rise and fall, assess the resilience of his networks, and plan for long-term influence. He understood that while power could be lost in a moment through legal action, betrayal, or circumstance, strategic vision and psychological mastery could preserve authority even in constrained conditions. This period of forced distance reinforced lessons about loyalty, human behavior, and the importance of reputation, principles that had underpinned his success throughout his career. Yet exile was not merely a test of strategy, it was a confrontation with mortality, legacy, and the limits of control. In Italy, Luciano confronted the reality of aging geopolitical instability and the shifting dynamics of global organized crime. He had to accept that his ability to directly shape events was reduced, and that the world he had dominated in New York was evolving without his constant presence. This acknowledgement did not diminish his influence entirely, but it required humility, patience, and the careful calibration of expectations. He had to navigate a new balance between ambition and reality, exercising restraint while still asserting authority where possible. During this final phase, Luciano also engaged in the philosophical dimension of power. Exile forced contemplation of the consequences of ambition, the cost of loyalty, and the transient nature of influence. The very elements that had facilitated his rise, ruthlessness, psychological mastery, strategic foresight, were now tools for survival and reflection rather than conquest. In this sense, exile became both punishment and opportunity, a crucible in which Luciano's genius could adapt to constraints, demonstrating that the true measure of power lies not only in control over others but in resilience, adaptability, and the capacity to maintain influence despite adverse circumstances. Ultimately, the exile and endgame period revealed the full complexity of Luciano's character and career. He was not merely a figure defined by criminal activity, violence, or ambition, but a master strategist, a psychologist of power, and a leader capable of shaping human behavior across continents. Even removed from the epicenter of his empire, he continued to exert influence, negotiate alliances, and maintain a presence in the world of organized crime that few could rival. Exile tested the limits of his abilities, but it also illuminated the enduring strength of intellect, reputation, and psychological insight as tools of power. In the end, Luciano's deportation marked a transformation rather than an end. It underscored the fragility of empire and the inevitability of change, but also highlighted the resilience of human ingenuity and the capacity for influence beyond immediate circumstances. His final years, spent navigating a world distant from the streets he once ruled, offered both a coda and a testament that even in retreat, the mind of a master strategist can shape events, command loyalty, and leave a legacy that reverberates far beyond personal presence. Exile, then, was not merely a conclusion, It was the final chapter in a story of power, psychology, and adaptation that defined one of history's most enigmatic and formidable figures. The legacy of Lucky Luciano is one of paradox, complexity, and enduring influence. While his life was defined by crime, violence, and audacity, it was equally shaped by intelligence, vision, and a strategic mind that transformed the very structure of organized crime. Luciano did more than rise to power. He reshaped the underworld, introducing systems, hierarchies, and psychological strategies that would influence criminal organizations for decades. His methods were studied, emulated, and feared, not merely because of the brutality they could unleash, but because of their efficiency, sophistication, and the understanding of human behavior they embodied. In many ways, Luciano's legacy extends beyond crime itself. It is a study of power, organization, and the dynamics of human ambition. At the core of his legacy is the concept of organization. Prior to Luciano, the mafia in America was fragmented, chaotic, and often driven by personal grudges or reactive violence. Luciano revolutionized this structure, consolidating power, establishing clear hierarchies, and codifying a system of governance that allowed the criminal enterprise to function with the efficiency of a legitimate corporation. Decisions were centralized, operations were coordinated, and loyalty was systematically enforced. By treating crime as a business, he created an empire that could generate wealth, influence, and control far more effectively than the disjointed systems that had existed before. This structural genius is a defining aspect of his enduring influence. Luciano's approach to human psychology also forms a critical part of his legacy. He understood that fear, respect, loyalty, and ambition could be leveraged to maintain order and compliance within his organization. Men were not controlled solely through intimidation or violence. They were motivated, manipulated, and guided through a combination of reward, consequence, and perception. This psychological mastery extended beyond immediate associates to rivals, law enforcement, and political actors. By understanding what drove human behavior, Luciano maintained authority over complex networks and navigated the inherently unstable world of organized crime with remarkable foresight. His methods became a blueprint for leaders who followed, demonstrating that power depends as much on intellect and influence as on force. The economic impact of Luciano's empire was significant. By systematizing illegal trades, gambling, prostitution, bootlegging, and labor racketeering, he transformed criminal operations into highly profitable, strategically coordinated enterprises. This efficiency not only increased wealth for his organization but also enabled broader influence across communities, unions, and political systems. Luciano demonstrated that criminal operations could be scalable, resilient, and strategically managed, establishing financial models that would shape organized crime on a global scale. His ability to integrate these ventures into a cohesive system remains one of the most remarkable aspects of his legacy. Beyond operations, Luciano's relationships with allies and rivals had lasting implications for the underworld. By consolidating power, negotiating alliances, and neutralizing threats, he created a network that extended far beyond New York. The partnerships he formed, particularly with figures like Meyer Lansky and Frank Costello, exemplified the integration of intellect, strategy, and loyalty in pursuit of mutual goals. These alliances, forged through a combination of trust, respect, and careful calculation, set a precedent for organized crime's evolution into an interconnected, hierarchical system that transcended geography. The influence of these relationships continues to be felt in the principles underlying modern organized crime. Luciano's fall and exile add a layer of complexity to his legacy. While his legal downfall revealed vulnerabilities and exposed the limits of control, it also highlighted his resilience, adaptability, and strategic brilliance. Even removed from the epicenter of his empire, he continued to wield influence, demonstrating that true power is not solely dependent on proximity but on reputation, psychological insight, and the careful orchestration of human behavior. This capacity to maintain authority despite significant constraints underscores the sophistication of his methods and cements his status as a master strategist, both feared and respected. Culturally, Luciano's legacy has been immortalized in myth, media, and historical scholarship. He became a symbol of ambition, cunning, and the allure of the underworld. Films, books, and documentaries have examined his life not merely for its criminality but for its insight into human ambition, leadership, and the dynamics of power. In popular imagination, he embodies both the seductive glamour of control and the moral consequences of unchecked ambition, a figure simultaneously admired, vilified, and analyzed. This cultural resonance ensures that his influence extends far beyond the immediate context of his life and operations. Luciano's legacy also reflects a broader lesson in the psychology of leadership. His ability to combine organizational genius, strategic foresight, and human insight demonstrates that influence is cultivated through perception, loyalty, and calculated action. Leaders in any field, legitimate or otherwise, can learn from the principles that guided him. The importance of anticipating rival actions, managing ambition, motivating allies, and maintaining resilience in the face of external pressures. His life provides a case study in the intersection of intellect, psychology, and power, illustrating the enduring relevance of strategic thinking across domains. In the end, Lucky Luciano's legacy is multifaceted. It is defined by the empire he built, the strategies he employed, and the psychological mastery he exercised over both allies and adversaries. It is also defined by the cautionary tale of ambition, vulnerability, and the impermanence of power. While his life was marked by crime, controversy, and moral complexity, it is equally marked by brilliance, adaptability, and an enduring influence on the structure and psychology of organized crime. His methods, insights, and strategic innovations continue to be studied, debated, and emulated, cementing his place as one of history's most consequential figures in the world of crime, and one of its most compelling enigmas. As the story of Lucky Luciano draws to its final chapter, the stark contrast between the man and the myth becomes impossible to ignore. To the world, he was a legendary figure, a criminal mastermind who rose from the chaos of New York streets to orchestrate an empire that spanned vice, gambling, unions, and political influence. His name inspired fear, fascination, and grudging respect. Newspapers chronicled his exploits as though they were the work of a brilliant tactician rather than a criminal. To his peers, he was the ultimate strategist, a man who could manipulate human ambition and fear with surgical precision. Yet, beneath the myth, the man himself was complex, a mixture of brilliance, ruthlessness, charm, and vulnerability. The conclusion of his life provides not only a lens into his character but also a meditation on the nature of power, ambition, and the human cost of a life spent navigating both legal and illicit worlds. Luciano's final years in Italy were marked by reflection, adaptation, and a bittersweet reckoning with mortality. Exile removed him from the streets he had once dominated, the clubs he had controlled, and the people whose loyalty had sustained him. The world he had built in New York continued to operate, yet without his constant presence, cracks began to appear. His influence was still felt, but it was now indirect, mediated through loyal lieutenants, intermediaries, and allies who carried out his instructions from afar. This removal underscored a fundamental truth about power. Even the most formidable empires are contingent, dependent upon structures, people, and circumstances that can never be fully controlled. Luciano's life illustrates that influence is both a product of design and a negotiation with forces beyond any one person's reach. Even in exile, Luciano remained acutely aware of the symbolic power he wielded. His reputation preceded him everywhere, and whispers of his organizational genius and psychological insight traveled faster than his own footsteps. European criminal networks, post-war intelligence agencies, and even politicians were aware that the man who had orchestrated New York's underworld was still an active strategist, capable of shaping outcomes from a distance. This reputation allowed him to maintain a level of authority and influence that belied his physical separation from the epicenter of his operations. It is a testament to the enduring power of intellect and perception. Control is as much about how others perceive you as about the actual decisions you make. However, exile also forced Luciano to confront limits he had never faced before. He could no longer micromanage operations, personally supervise enforcers, or respond immediately to threats. This period highlighted the fragility of even the most well-constructed empires and demonstrated that human networks, no matter how carefully cultivated, are inherently dynamic. Rivals tested boundaries, lieutenants weighed ambition against loyalty, and the absence of direct oversight required adaptation. For Luciano, strategy now included patience, psychological maneuvering, and the careful use of intermediaries. He had to trust others more than ever, knowing that the slightest miscommunication or act of betrayal could have repercussions that would echo across continents. This distance from power also provided him with perspective. Luciano could observe the evolution of his empire and reflect on the broader consequences of his actions. Decisions that once seemed purely tactical now revealed their moral and social impact. Families destroyed, lives affected, communities influenced. While he had built his empire on efficiency and psychological insight, the human cost was immense. Exile forced him to grapple with the reality that no amount of strategic brilliance could erase the consequences of his choices. Yet, it also reinforced his understanding of the resilience and adaptability required to survive in a world defined by volatility, lawlessness, and ambition. The myth of Lucky Luciano, however, persisted undiminished. Films, books, and media portrayals immortalized him as the archetype of the cunning, charismatic criminal. He became a symbol of audacity, a man who could bend systems, people, and circumstances to his will. Hollywood glamorized his rise, dramatizing the conflicts and betrayals that defined his life, creating an image of a man simultaneously feared and admired. But myth and reality diverged in meaningful ways. While he was undoubtedly brilliant, his life was also a study in human vulnerability. Betrayals, legal pressures, imprisonment, and exile were constant reminders that no empire, no matter how well organized, is impervious to external forces. The legend of Luciano reveals the allure of power, but his reality exposes the fragility upon which it rests. Luciano's exile also amplified the philosophical dimensions of his life. He had spent decades navigating the complex interplay of loyalty, fear, ambition, and strategy. In his final years, these reflections deepened. Power, he must have realized, is transient. Empires rise and fall, alliances shift, and human behavior is inherently unpredictable. His career, though marked by extraordinary success, was ultimately defined by the tension between the illusion of control and the reality of vulnerability. This duality, the tension between genius and human limitation, is central to understanding his enduring fascination. Luciano was both master and subject of the systems he created, capable of extraordinary manipulation yet always constrained by forces beyond his control. Even at the end, his influence remained instructive. The structures he created, the hierarchies he established, and the psychological strategies he deployed continued to shape organized crime long after his death. Modern criminal enterprises owe much to the systems he pioneered: centralized decision-making, strategic management of rivalries, and the integration of fear and loyalty as tools of control. While the methods may have evolved, the principles endure. Luciano's life serves as a case study in leadership, psychology, and organizational strategy, a testament to the ways intelligence, perception, and human insight can extend influence even in challenging circumstances. Yet, perhaps the most compelling aspect of his final chapter is the interplay between human fragility and enduring legacy. Luciano was, ultimately, a man subject to mortality, exile, and the consequences of his choices. He experienced imprisonment, public humiliation, and forced removal from the life he had meticulously curated. But even in this constrained state, he remained a strategist, a manipulator, and a leader, demonstrating that influence transcends mere physical presence. The human mind, reputation, and psychological mastery can extend power beyond immediate circumstances, a lesson that resonates far beyond the realm of organized crime. Throughout his final years, Luciano also confronted the contrast between ambition and its costs. He had achieved unprecedented levels of power, yet that same ambition had drawn the scrutiny of law enforcement, the envy of rivals, and the eventual force of deportation. This duality underscores a profound truth. The pursuit of power, especially through unrestrained means, comes with consequences that extend beyond the individual to the broader social and moral landscape. Luciano's life, in its conclusion, becomes a meditation on the paradox of ambition. Brilliance and ruthlessness can achieve remarkable results, yet the same traits inevitably invite resistance, scrutiny, and vulnerability. Historians and contemporaries alike have reflected on this duality. Some emphasize his genius, his organizational skill, and his ability to anticipate human behavior. Others highlight the human costs, the violence, and the moral ambiguities that defined his actions. Reconciling these perspectives reveals the richness of his character. A man who was at once brilliant and ruthless, visionary and constrained, mythic and deeply human. The interplay of these qualities ensures that his story is not merely a chronicle of crime, but a study of leadership, psychology, and the dynamics of power. In examining his life as a whole, the contrast between myth and reality offers lessons that transcend time and context. Luciano's genius lay not only in his strategic brilliance but also in his understanding of perception, human behavior, and organizational dynamics. Yet, his downfall, exile, and ultimate mortality remind us that even the most formidable figures are vulnerable to forces beyond their control. In this way, his story is both cautionary and inspirational, a testament to the potential of intellect and strategy, and a reminder of the limits that govern human ambition. Ultimately, the conclusion of Luciano's life is a meditation on power, influence, and the human condition. It is a story of brilliance tempered by vulnerability, strategy tempered by circumstance, and ambition tempered by mortality. His legend endures, but so does the lesson that control is always contingent, and that even the greatest empires are fragile when confronted by law, human ambition, and the inexorable passage of time. Luciano's story invites reflection on the nature of leadership, the consequences of ambition, and the delicate balance between perception and reality. Lucky Luciano's end reminds us that power is never absolute, influence is never guaranteed, and legacy is forged through both action and perception. The man who once commanded New York's underworld, who orchestrated alliances, rivalries, and empires with unparalleled skill, spent his final years removed from the epicenter of his power. Yet, in exile and reflection, his mind, reputation, and strategies continued to shape the world he had left behind. This final chapter underscores the enduring complexity of his life. A man capable of extraordinary genius, both feared and revered, whose story illuminates the intricate dynamics of power, ambition, and human psychology. Even as the streets of New York evolved and the criminal world adapted to new realities, Luciano's influence remained. His systems, his approach to loyalty and fear, and his strategic mindset became a blueprint for subsequent generations. Through the lens of history, his life offers a study not only of crime but of leadership, resilience, and the ways human intellect can extend influence far beyond immediate circumstances. The man and the myth converge in his final years, demonstrating that while power is impermanent, insight, strategy, and psychological mastery leave a legacy that endures long after empires fall and individuals fade. In conclusion, Lucky Luciano's life and final chapter stand as both a testament and a warning. Brilliance can achieve extraordinary heights, ambition can reshape worlds, and strategy can extend influence across time and space. But vulnerability, mortality, and the forces beyond human control remain ever present. His story is a mirror reflecting the complexities of human ambition, the duality of perception and reality, and the enduring interplay between genius and consequence. Even in exile, even at the end of his life, Luciano remained a master of influence, a strategist of human behavior, and a figure whose legacy continues to reverberate across history, crime, and culture.